Alright guys, I'm here back with a new video, and in this video I'm back with a new casting video, but one that's a bit different, where obviously normally I've done Survivor and some Big Brother casting videos. However, I've never done one for the challenge, so here I decided to do one, and I will say the process for this video was a bit weird, where I actually didn't have a fully formed theme that I wanted to go with the challenge here. I more so just put a list of people that I would like to see back, and then when narrowing it down, I decided on what theme I wanted to put together, with that theme for this video ending up being old school versus new school, which I know is the theme that has been talked about for the challenge 40 of something that they could do there. And I do think it would feel like a fitting way to celebrate the show's 40th season, though I will say after putting this list together, I'm not entirely sure on how exciting that season would be, especially with the recent appearance of all-star seasons, which means that we've seen a lot of those people back already, because I tried to shake it up a bit here. I tried to make this a group reveal that at least isn't the same sort of reveal we've been seeing over and over again from recent seasons, but I still wanted to keep this a semi-realistic cast as well. So what I decided to do for this cast, I ended up making this a cast of 32, 16 old school players, 16 new school players, where initially the breakout point was going to be rivals, as that's technically, by the time of the challenge 40, the halfway point. However, I kind of realized it doesn't fully work out that way, so I did make it a little bit later, to where the breakout point ends up essentially being Battle of the Bloodlines here instead. So here I'll be running through the people that I decided to cast for a season like this, with again this trying to be somewhat grounded in reality. So let's start off with the old school players, where again this is kind of tough here, as I did want this to be a group of people that were still competitive with the new school. I didn't want this to be a situation where the old school players, obviously typically being older, end up being completely outclassed by the younger players. So because I did end up making specific choices and I'm cutting specific people that I didn't necessarily want to cut. I mean, I would have liked to have like legends of the game like Beth and Veronica, and even like a Tina or a Trishelle, or like some of these other big names from early on that would have been cool to have back for like a landmark season like this. However, again, realistically, do I think they'll be able to compete with the new school competitors? Not really. So again, I decided to leave them off. Mark Long was someone that I very much considered, but I kind of decided that one, again, similar-ish thing, even though I do think he could probably hold his own, but also it's like Mark Long's not the most riveting TV. So I decided to leave him off because of that. Obviously, the likes of someone like The Miz and Svetlana and Evelyn is a big one. Even a Landon you can add to that. Again, like I just don't think they're likely to say yes, so I decided not to put them on. Also beyond that, I think there's some pretty big names that I decided not put on the list here, from the likes of Yes to Alton to Brad to Derek. MJ was another one in consideration. I didn't put Nani or Anissa on, though that sounds about right. Also they include Jody. Like I do feel like there's some pretty big names here that were in consideration, though none of them actually end up making the cut. So let's talk about the old school players that did make the cut here. Now here I'll be going through them in order of when they first played. So let's start off with what might be a really random pick. This is probably not the greatest place to be starting. However, I did end up putting on Susie Meister, and this is someone that, do I actually expect to see on the challenge? Not really, but is also someone that seems to be willing to do it. And again, like this is kind of a weird place to start, as this is like probably the most random old school pick I have on here. However, we do know that Sarah Rice for All Stars 4 talks about how she would have been willing to do it had they agreed to let her go on with Susie, to which they obviously denied for some reason. However, I decided, screw it. What if we live in a world where they would say yes for the challenge 40? So I decided to put her on. I didn't think Susie would have been a pretty cool old school competitor to have on a season like this. I don't know how she would do in the modern challenge. I think she is the biggest question mark in that sense, to where I think out of this old school field, she's probably the person I would have the least amount of faith in coming into it to still be at the standard that you would expect for the challenge, though. Again, why not? She's a legend of the game. She has a very strong track record, and to keep in line for her relationship with Sarah, I decided to keep her on the list here. Next one, a person that's probably a bit more predictable here. I did end up putting Rachel Robinson on the list. I do feel like Rachel's still someone that is obviously in very good shape still. Well, again, I don't know if she really stands up to the best of the challenge. I think for the old school field here, she perfectly fits in. Again, she's one of the older school people, left on the board I think is probably still willing to come back. She obviously was just on All-Stars 4, where again, out of the old school field, I do feel like she's one of the most likely to still be able to keep up with the modern crowd. So again, she made the list. Also, I did put on Darrell, which this one was a bit more up in the air for me, where Darrell is someone that I find so weird in the sense that he's obviously this big legend in the game. He had this great track record back in the day, but he's been on so much recently to where it does feel like he's a bit overexposed. However, because that, it's also like, well, he's obviously going to say yes to a season like this though, isn't he? So it's like, it kind of makes him an easy person to put on, but it's also like, he's gotten to the point where like, I don't know if I necessarily need to see Darrell on, especially because like he's very hung up on playing a kind of boring game of him just playing the middle, the strategy that worked very effectively when he was by far the best competitor on his cast. However, he's simply not anymore, and I think that definitely lessens the appeal of his strategy to where it's just kind of boring, and it's eventually one that's going to catch up to him. But I feel like for a season like this, again, he does feel like a perfect old school candidate here, one of the bigger names of the challenge. So again, I still put him on. Also, obviously, you got to have CT on the board. Again, debatably the best challenge competitor of all time. I like to have him in this field of some of the other greatest of all time. Makes perfect sense. Again, perfect old school pick. Again, he was pretty easy to put on. Same thing goes with Wes. Again, while we have seen Wes a lot recently, and again, his shtick is still the same, I still feel like Wes is still someone that still makes great TV. Like, while again, his storylines can be a bit manufactured, I do feel like as a whole, Wes is still one of the most legendary figures in the game to where it makes sense to bring him back for a landmark season like this. And the same thing goes with Bananas, where, like, truth be told, I don't need to see Bananas back again. If this is just any random season of the challenge that I put together, I probably wouldn't put Bananas on. But for, again, this like kind of landmark season like this, old school versus new school, I feel like it makes sense to put Bananas on there. Again, I feel like it makes sense to have him as this like older legend of the game to where he faces off against some of the best. Even though, I mean, like, in reality, when we look at the cast as a whole, I believe he has actually been on the season with all of these people at one point. But still, again, trying to make this cast the best of the best, I feel like you can't do that without Bananas. Next up, jumping to the women's side of things for a while, actually, we're now continuing on with Sarah Rice, where, again, I already said it earlier that Susie's on, mainly because I think it would make sense to have her on with Sarah Rice. Mind you, again, Sarah Rice and Bananas together, probably not going to work. I think that makes this, like, somewhat unrealistic. But again, like, I feel like Sarah Rice feels like the perfect, like, old school candidate to bring back, someone that would still be very good, someone that seems to be willing to come back. Again, probably not if Bananas is on the season, but screw it, I'm doing it anyway. Will this really happen? Probably not. But I still think Sarah Rice is someone that, again, I think can do very well in the challenge still. I think makes her a pretty good pick here. Following that, we're getting into the trio of really strong Fresh Meat 2 competitors that I would like to see all of them back on a season like this. First up, we got Laurel, who obviously we have seen back a decent chunk more recently, though I think Laurel for, again, season 40, an old school versus new school style season, I feel like having Laurel back would make a lot of sense. Again, one of the best to play the game, so perfect candidate there. Also, I did bring back Teresa, which I don't know how likely this is at this point. Teresa doesn't seem to be super apt to want to play again. However, I've always personally really liked Teresa. While again, she might not be the most agreeable person in the world, I always thought she made for pretty decent TV. She's always been a player that had a lot of potential, and while she's always made strategic mistakes that caused her potential to not really be properly utilized, I do feel like Teresa's type of player that I would like to see back. I think she's going to be a mess still, make strategic mistakes. I think she'll be fun to watch, so I put her on. And also, I ended up putting on Cara Maria because I think Cara Maria is probably one of the best casting choices for the challenge. For the fact that she was gone for so long and seemingly from MTV's point of view is kind of ridiculous in my mind. To where it's like, yes, she can get a bit toxic at points and can straight up be unlikable at points. I think she also still makes for really good TV and is a really great competitor to where, for me, it's really not a question that I would bring her back on this season. Next up, moving off of Fresh Meat 2, but still keeping with the women, here I do have Emily. This was a pick that I was a bit more hesitant on. I mean, the main reason I put Emily on the cast here is because, again, I'm trying to make this like the best of the best, and I do feel like Emily is obviously one that's commonly talked about as one of the best female challenge competitors, and I think because that having Emily on makes sense. Now, again, I don't know how likely it is that she would say yes, so I think it's probably more likely than someone like an Evelyn. So it's like, realistically, I would rather see Evelyn back. Zach than Emily, but I think Emily is still somewhat likely for a big season like this to where I decided to put her on instead. Next up, moving back to the men finally, and here, despite his retirement, I'm putting on Leroy, because Leroy said he was retired and he's not actually retired, is he? So why not? Putting him on for a season like this. Again, I just think it would be great to finally see Leroy win, even though it's never going to happen, is it? Oh, why not? Give him another chance here. See how it goes. Now moving on to the final woman on the board, at least for old school. Here I do have Jeanne, who, again, in the modern day, after All-Stars 2 and 3, has really shown herself to be one of the best female challenge competitors. And while, again, I don't know how well it really translates to the main show, which has significantly less puzzle-based challenges than were there in All-Stars 2 and 3, which really benefited her. I do feel like Jeanne is still a really strong competitor, where having her back for a season like this just makes all the sense in the world. So again, I put her on. And now let's wrap up the men left on the board. Starting off someone that I don't like this person. However, he makes for good TV. And he's been gone from our screens long enough to where I'm like, I wouldn't be opposed to seeing him back, even though, again, I don't like this person or support this person from a real world standpoint. But here I do have Zach. And again, Zach's not particularly likable. From the way he acts on the show, he just seems like kind of a dick. But again, he has good confessionals. He does make for some good TV moments. He is not really the type of player that's just going to stick to a pack. He usually tries to play the middle and plays the middle poorly. So again, I feel like Zach, so I wouldn't be opposed to be on a season like this. So I put him on. And to go along with him, someone that has been away from the challenge for a while. And again, I don't know how likely it is that he'll actually come back, but I think it'll be interesting to see Frank Sweeney back. Now, Frank is someone that was on 3 seasons, had a really, really great run throughout those 3 seasons. From a competitive standpoint, that also came off extremely unlikable through those 3 seasons, but still really great TV. But I do think having him return would be really interesting, where he seems to have mellowed out over time, which again might not make for the most riveting TV, might not be as good TV as he was in the past, though I do think it'll be interesting to see how much he's changed over time, to see him play the game with more life experience, to where, yeah, I think Frank back, I think it'll be really interesting for me personally, so I decided to put him on the cast. And the final person for old school is, again, another person I don't really need to see back, but again, if we're doing the best of the best, I guess we gotta have Jordan. I mean, Jordan's obviously at this point, for sure, one of the best challenge competitors. I mean, it seems like he's at least not as icky as he used to be, to where at least that's kind of mellowed out. And while I personally don't like his storylines, particularly the ones revolving around Tori, spoiler, Tori's not here, so who cares? And Jordan's also obviously the recent winner of World Championship, where through that I do feel like it kind of bolstered his legacy on this list as well. So I was like, screw it, let's put Jordan. But there we go. I mean, that's the entire old school field. Now let's get into the new school field, which essentially starts with Battle of the Bloodlines, or at least the first person that made the list, they'd come from Battle of the Bloodlines. Now, I will say as a whole, I do feel like the new school players were very tough to cast, largely because I feel like the new school cast is just so clicky. And I specifically wanted to cast this in a way that it broke up a lot of the cliques that are there, that a lot of the people that we see on the show over and over and over again aren't here together. So because that, again, some pretty common names are not on the board here. People like a Devin, people like a Nelson, people like a Josh. Though I should also state that another rule I essentially put in place by the end of it is that every player here has to be in a final, which is another reason why Josh didn't make the cut, or why someone like a Jay didn't make the cut. Also why like Amanda Garcia didn't make the cut, as I really wanted to put her on. I did consider someone like a Kayla, someone like a Nicole Zanata, someone like a Georgia, but they didn't make the cut. I ended up cutting someone like a Davon because of that all finalists rule as well. I cut Casey and Tori because who wants Casey and Tori back on their screens? I would have considered Amber B, however, she's talked about stepping away from the challenge for a bit. But with that, let's get into the actual people that made the list. Now, I will say also the new school players, I did include people that were on the spin-off shows as well. This isn't fully just limited to the main challenge. However, all the spin-off shows that these people come from obviously happened within this new school era of the show, to where it makes sense anyway. But we'll go through the people that were on the main show first, where the earliest person on the board here, again, the only person that debuted in Battle of the Bloodlines, we do have Corey. And Corey was essentially the last guy to be solidified on the list here. Really, it's like, again, I feel like there were a decent amount of people fighting for a final spot. I decided to go Corey just because I feel like Corey's at least probably more willing to shake things up. I feel like Corey is one of these vets that, again, while he does have connections, he also has like a lot of bad blood with certain vets, to where I could definitely see him going directly after someone like a Bananas. I could see him at least trying things, to where at least that's something. At least he's not going to keep the status quo in a position where he's on the bottom. At least you wouldn't think. So again, I had Corey here. Also, I ended up putting on Ashley Mitchell, who obviously had this situation on Spies, Lies, and Allies, where who knows if she'll actually come back after that. But I think Ashley for a season like this, again, this like big landmark season, I feel like it makes all sense in the world to have Ashley on here. Obviously one of the biggest names in recent seasons, and through that is just a very likely returning in my eyes. Same thing goes with Cam, where again, if we're having Leroy back, why not bring Cam back as well? Really, I mean, Cam's probably even more likely to be on the cast than Leroy, where I think Cam probably is in it for a long haul until she eventually wins. To where having Cam back for a season like this just, again, makes all sense in the world. Again, I think she's one of the best new school players on the board, so why not have her back? Next one might be a bit more of a controversial pick here. However, I did also decide to bring back Rogan, which I'm kind of conflicted on in the fact that, like, I think Rogan, to me, like, through watching seasons 34 and 35, is one of my favorite villains on the show. Like, he's just kind of a dick, and like, you're not rooting for him, but always found him to be kind of an interesting villain, and it did seem like his overall competitiveness was getting better throughout those 2 seasons. Now, outside the show, I believe he is a bit problematic, which is why I was a bit hesitant to put him on the list here. But again, if we're going from a pure TV standpoint, I do feel like he can bring great TV, and he is a solid competitor, so I was like, why not? Let's bring him back. And with that, same thing goes for Paulie, where I brought back Paulie Calafiore. Again, like, he's here, Cara Maria. I think that's at least an interesting dynamic. He, again, is going to bring a lot of drama. He's also a decent competitor. Like, I feel like, to me, Paulie is a near perfect challenge competitor, to where he's so cocky, to where he makes good TV because of that. He's a good enough competitor to where, like, he feels justified in being on the show, but also more than likely he's going to make a mistake by the end, to where watching his downfall is just as fun. Like, to me, I feel like Paulie is like the type of person that I want on the challenge. So again, he made it on for me. Also ended up putting on someone that I didn't think I was going to put on, because this is a person that I've kind of gotten over in his last appearance, but for a big season like this, I guess we're putting on Turbo, where Turbo, again, like, is not really someone I need to see on the show anymore. I think his shtick is kind of getting old for me, especially with, like, the fact that he seems to not be the most stable presence in the house. However, I think for a big season like this, see him face off against these other bigger names in the game, it's like, why not? Let's bring back Turbo for that sake, even though probably won't go too well for him. But also here, I decided to bring back Theo, who we also see come back for World Championship and perform pretty well there. Like, I wouldn't be opposed to seeing him back on the challenge proper. While he doesn't have as long of a legacy as certain other players on this cast, I do feel like he definitely has the potential to become one of the best challenge competitors, so decided to put him on here. Finally, moving back to the women's side of things, here we do have a woman that I've been wanting back on the challenge for a while. Even though she's not the most riveting TV, I do think she is one of the best challenge competitors possibly all time if we see more seasons with her, and that person is Jenny West. Where, again, the fact that she completely dominates Total Madness and then hasn't been back since, despite being an alternate multiple times, is really ridiculous to me. Where, like, I guess production just finds her boring, but also it's like, you're casting Casey. At least Jenny wouldn't be the same person over and over again at this point. So again, I decided to put Jenny on, especially because I would like to see more of her so we can get a better sense of her as an overall challenge competitor. After that, we're moving back to the men, where here I did put Fessy on the cast. Now, this one was a bit of a debate for me, as Fessy is obviously part of this group that typically runs these modern challenge seasons, though one, he's kind of on the outs of that group, and two, most of that group isn't even on the season anyway, so screw it, we're putting Fessy on. Now, again, I think Fessy can be lukewarm TV. I don't think he's necessarily going to be the best TV all the time, though I think he has a propensity for making these big moves at points that cause a lot of drama, and then even beyond that, I do think he is a pretty solid competitor, to where I do think it would be interesting to see him face off against the best of the best. So again, I decided to put Fessy on. After that, I do have 2 returnees from Ride or Dies here, 2 of the bigger names from that season, to where, again, I think they make perfect sense to represent the new school for this season. And that's obviously first Horacio, where Horacio, again, proved himself to be a really strong competitor there. Again, potentially could have won had they not been DQ'd. Very likable guy. Again, while he's not the most riveting TV, he's someone that I definitely want to see back. So I thought a season like this makes sense. And the same thing goes for Olivia. I do feel like having her as a representative for the new school of the challenge kind of makes sense here, as I do think she's a very solid competitor in her own right. So with that, again, that's caught up on the challenge proper. We still have 5 people left to talk about, all of which coming from spinoffs, most of them being women. Where really, I feel like that's what made the women field so tough for me, is that I felt like there were so many women from the spinoffs that I wanted to add in here, where there wasn't as much with the men, which made the men a bit tougher to put together. But with that for the women, first we're starting off with someone from Champs Versus. And here I did put on Luis. And I really love Luis when I watch Champs Versus. I'll be honest, at this point, I haven't ended up rewatching Champs Versus yet, to where I don't have the greatest memory of Champs Versus. However, what I do remember is that I love Luis in the 2 seasons she was on. So really for me, it was between her and Zara, of the two like British women that were proteges of Wes, to put on the list here. But I felt like Luis was someone that I was more wanting on the cast, even though I'm a bit more hesitant on like, would Luis say yes over Zara? But again, I decided to go with Luis here. And the rest of these people end up coming from the World Championship Series. So from Challenge USA, the last guy on the board ends up being Danny. And again, I really like Danny on the challenge. Like, I was pleasantly surprised with his run on World Championship, to where I really liked how hard he played. I really liked him being willing to mix it up with the vets. And overall, he's just a really solid challenge competitor, to where I thought he was a good pick here. And to go along with that, I also put Sarah Lucina, which is mind-blowing that I'm putting Sarah Lucina on a cast like this. But again, I thought Sarah was also a big surprise for me on World Championship. I thought she was pretty fun there. And again, she's a solid competitor. She's someone that's willing to make big moves, go against the vets. Like, I feel like she's a decent pick here, so I went with her. Next up, from the Challenge AU side of things, I did also go with Kiki here, where I really like Kiki on both the Challenge AU and World Championship. I thought she was a likable figure on both of them. I think she's the type of person that people underestimate, but then ends up being a really solid competitor. I feel like seeing her face off against the Cara Marias, the Laurels, the Cams, and Ashleys of the world, I think would be really interesting, so I put her on. And the final person for my cast here is someone that may not be the most riveting TV in the world. However, I do feel like to add to the prestige of this cast, I did end up putting on Kaz. Because, I mean, she won World Championship, so at least that's something. And again, she's not entirely bad. She's she's probably not the most riveting TV in the world, but she's still a really strong challenge competitor. And same thing with the previous two. And like, I think seeing her face off against these bigger names would be interesting to see, so I put her on. But there we go. I mean, that is the entire cast of the challenge, old school versus new school. Again, from the old school side of things. So for the men, I did have Darrell, CT, Wes, Johnny Bananas, Leroy, Zach, Frank Sweeney, and Jordan. For the women, I had Susie, Rachel Robinson, Sarah Rice, Laurel, Teresa, Cara Maria, Emily Schrum, and John A. And for the new school, for the men, I did have Corey, Rogan, Paulie Calafiore, Turbo, Theo, Fessy, Horacio, and Danny. While for the women, I had Ashley Mitchell, Cam, Jenny West, Olivia, Luis, Sarah Lucina, Kiki, and Kaz. So again, that is my cast for the challenge. Old school versus new school, essentially under the pretense that this was the challenge 40. Now moving forward, I would like to do more challenge videos. I still want to do a top 10 male and female competitors of all time at some point down the road. Obviously, just in general, I'll be covering new seasons of the challenge moving forward. I also would like to get around to doing my spin-off ranking that I've been talking about for a while, though I'm kind of waiting for certain spin-offs to conclude. So stay tuned for all those things. But for now, that's the video. Thank you for watching.